He was treated like an intruder on the land he had owned for nearly 15 years. One phone call from a neighbor turned him into a suspect on his own front lawn. She thought the rules gave her power. She thought humiliation would keep him quiet. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. Because Calvin Rauden wasn't a man who shouted. He wasn't a man who fought in the open. He was a man who waited. And when her most prized possession went up for sale, he struck with a move so clean, so silent, and so devastating, that the entire neighborhood would never forget it. This is not just a story about property. This is a story about control, dignity, and what happens when patience becomes power. The afternoon sun in Lakeway had the kind of warmth that slowed time down, turning the surface of Lake Travis into a mirror of light. It was the kind of day made for fishing or barbecue, for easy talk and laughter. For Calvin Rauden, it was supposed to be the day he took the first real step toward letting go of his ranch. A camera was slung across his shoulder, the strap worn smooth from years of use. His realtor, Samantha Cruz, walked beside him, flipping through a folder of documents with the brisk confidence of someone who had sold dozens of homes. They moved slowly across the lawn, Calvin pausing now and then to frame a shot, the porch washed in gold, the oaks lifting green hands into the breeze, the dock stretching out like an arm into the shining lake. He felt a bittersweet tug in his chest. 15 years of life were caught in every angle of this property, sweat hammered into nails, memories painted into walls. He told himself the sale was necessary. Dallas was calling, and the ranch had grown too big for a man who mostly lived alone. But necessity didn't stop the ache. The sound of tires on gravel broke his thoughts. At first Calvin assumed it was a neighbor pulling in, maybe Victor from down the road. Then he saw the glint of sunlight off a sheriff's badge on the hood of a white SUV. The vehicle stopped halfway up the drive, dust curling around its wheels. 2 deputies stepped out. Samantha froze, clutching her folder. Calvin frowned, lowering his camera. He had no reason to expect them. "Afternoon, sir," one deputy said. His voice was steady but firm, his hand resting near his belt. "We got a call about suspicious activity here." For a second Calvin thought he'd misheard. Suspicious? He looked around as if the word must belong to someone else, someone hiding in the bushes. "This is my ranch," he said, a half laugh in his voice. "I live here." He gestured toward the house, toward Samantha. "We're taking photos for a listing." Nothing suspicious about that. The deputies didn't relax. One of them tilted his head, eyes scanning the house as though it were an unfamiliar place. "Mind showing me some ID, sir?" The request landed like a stone in Calvin's chest. He wasn't angry yet, just stunned. For 15 years, this had been his sanctuary. His dock, his trees, his porch. And now, on a day when the sun should have been his only witness, he was being asked to prove he belonged. He fished out his wallet, handed over his driver's license. The deputy studied it, compared the address with the mailbox at the end of the drive. The match was obvious. Still, the process dragged out like a small public trial. Samantha shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "This is ridiculous." Calvin forced a polite smile. "Of course, officer. Whatever you need." When the radio crackled back that everything checked out, the deputies softened. "All good here," one said. "Sorry for the trouble. Just had to follow up on the call." They turned and walked back to their SUV, the dust of their arrival lingering longer than they did. Calvin watched them leave, the polite smile still on his face, though it never reached his eyes. Then he saw her. Across the cul-de-sac, half hidden behind her hedge, stood Patricia Norwell. Arms crossed, posture stiff, her presence undeniable. She didn't wave, didn't speak, but Calvin didn't need words. He knew. Patricia, the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of order. She had moved in 5 years after Calvin, and in that time had made herself impossible to ignore. She complained about grass heights measured with a tape measure. She had once sent a written notice to a neighbor for leaving a kayak on their dock overnight. She wasn't just picky, she was relentless. And today, she had decided that Calvin Rauden, owner of the ranch for nearly 15 years, was suspicious activity. Calvin felt a mix of disbelief and quiet anger rising in him. Not the kind that made you shout. The kind that settled deep, like a coal glowing in the dark. As he packed away his camera, he muttered under his breath, "She's not getting the last word in this." Samantha glanced at him but stayed silent. She could see the wheels already turning behind his calm eyes. That night, Calvin sat on his porch with a glass of bourbon, staring across the lake. The water shimmered under the setting sun, as peaceful as ever. But he felt none of it. He replayed the moment again and again, the deputy's tone, the cold request for ID, the way Patricia stood watching like a hawk that had finally swooped. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was degrading. She had called the sheriff not because she feared crime, but because she craved control. And Calvin knew, as the night settled around him, that a line had been crossed. Patricia had fired her shot. And one day soon, he would take his. Calvin Rauden had not been born into land. He was born into borrowed rooms and rented walls, into the constant shuffle of boxes and leases, the quiet fragility of places that were never truly his. His earliest memories were of the small duplex in Lubbock where his mother, Mary Ann, came home after double shifts as a nurse, her face drawn with exhaustion yet somehow still finding the strength to smile at him. The house was tidy but cramped, the yard little more than a strip of dirt that baked in the Texas sun. It was there, in that tiny yard, that Calvin first learned what it meant to want space. He remembered being a boy of 8, crouched in the dust with a toy truck, when the landlord pulled up in a rusted pickup and barked at them for letting weeds grow against the fence. Marianne had apologized softly, but Calvin had burned with a quiet shame. That evening, when the two of them sat at the kitchen table eating scrambled eggs for dinner, Calvin had asked, "Mom, will we ever have our own place? A place nobody can take away?" She had reached across, smoothed his hair, and said, "One day, son. One day you'll plant your feet on soil that's yours. And when you do, you'll know the difference." Those words became a promise he carried like a secret flame. As a teenager, he worked odd jobs after school, stocking shelves at the grocery store, hauling lumber for a local contractor, mowing lawns until his hands blistered. He didn't complain. Every dollar mattered. College came, but not the kind you see in glossy brochures. He commuted, studied logistics because it was practical, and worked nights in a warehouse to pay tuition. Marianne was proud, though she worried he was grinding himself down. Calvin would just shrug. He was building something. He didn't know when or how, but he was. When Marianne grew older and her health faltered, Calvin took over more of the weight. By the time she passed, he was already working steadily as a logistics manager in San Marcos, a job that demanded order and precision, the very qualities that had defined his life since boyhood. Her funeral was small, quiet, but when neighbors spoke about her, the word that came up most was steadfast. Calvin knew he had inherited that from her. It was only a year later, at age 29, that Calvin stumbled across the property that would change his life. He hadn't even meant to be looking. A friend from work mentioned a ranch for sale near Lake Travis, a fixer-upper with potential. Out of curiosity, Calvin drove out one Saturday. The place was rough. The roof sagged, the fencing leaned like tired shoulders, and the dock was half sunk into the lake, boards splintering from neglect. But when Calvin stood on the porch and looked across the water, something inside him shifted. The air was wide, the silence alive. It wasn't polished, but it was his mother's promise made visible, land that could be his, if he dared. He didn't hesitate. He scraped together savings, took a loan that made him sweat, and signed papers with a hand that shook only once. The first years were backbreaking. He spent weekends hammering nails, sanding warped wood, repairing shingles beneath the Texas sun. Contractors helped with the heavy work, but Calvin insisted on doing much himself. Each nail driven into fresh boards felt like planting a flag. Each coat of paint felt like a declaration, "This is mine. I belong here." Slowly, the ranch transformed. The sagging roof gave way to sturdy beams. The dock was rebuilt plank by plank until it stretched confidently into the lake. The yard, once wild, became green with grass and shaded by young trees he had planted himself. By the 5th year, the place no longer looked like a fixer-upper. It looked like a home. And it was more than wood and soil. It was memory, woven into the property like threads in a quilt. His nephew learned to fish off the dock one summer, squealing when he caught his first perch. Marian had sat on the porch in her last healthy years, sipping iced tea, marveling at the water as though it were a miracle. Birthdays, barbecues, and late-night talks had all taken place under that roof. So when Calvin thought about selling, it wasn't numbers on a page that gave him pause. It was the weight of history. This ranch wasn't just an asset, it was proof that he had taken his mother's words and made them real. Proof that a boy who once played in dust behind a duplex could build something lasting. And that was why the encounter with the sheriff cut so deep. To be treated like a trespasser here, on land he had bled and sweated for, was more than inconvenient. It was a wound to the very core of who he was. As he sat on the porch at night, bourbon glass warm in his hand, Calvin thought back to that 8-year-old boy asking his mother if they would ever have a place of their own. He had built it. He had kept the promise. And now, Patricia Norwell had tried to strip it away with a single phone call. That was something Calvin would not forgive. Patricia Norwell had not always lived on the shores of Lake Travis, but by the time she arrived she carried herself as though she had been sent to guard it. She was in her late 50s, recently divorced, the sharpness in her voice honed by years of disappointment and control battles she refused to lose. Some said the end of her marriage had hardened her. Others whispered that she had always been this way, that her need for rules and order was less about community and more about survival. Whatever the reason, Patricia became the neighborhood's enforcer almost the moment she unpacked her boxes. She was known for the black binder she carried everywhere, an oversized 3-ring folder stuffed with the bylaws of the Homeowners Association. The pages were highlighted, tabbed, and cross-referenced, as though she were preparing for trial. And in her mind, every day was a trial. Every lawn, every mailbox, every porch light was evidence waiting to be inspected. Neighbors learned quickly. The Johnsons remembered the first time Patricia knocked on their door, a polite smile, a notice in hand, informing them that their recycling bin had been visible for longer than the acceptable 2-hour window. Judy Blanchard still told the story of the inflatable snowman she put up one December, a cheerful decoration for her grandkids. Patricia filed 3 separate violation notices, claiming it exceeded height limits and violated community decor standards. When Judy ignored them, Patricia arrived at her doorstep with a tape measure in hand. Judy slammed the door before Patricia could finish her sentence. Victor Hanley had his own tale. He loved wind chimes, the soft tinkling a soundtrack to his porch evenings. Patricia insisted they violated a noise ordinance. Noise ordinance. Victor would grumble to anyone who would listen. You'd think I was blasting rock music, not letting a breeze pass through. To some, Patricia was merely a nuisance. To others, she was dangerous. Because Patricia didn't just complain, she escalated. She had a talent for taking minor annoyances and turning them into violations, then turning those violations into confrontations. And she thrived on confrontation. Once she had you in her sights, she didn't let go. But what unsettled neighbors most was the way she watched. Curtains shifting when cars pulled in. Blinds tilted when someone worked in their yard. She noticed everything, and nothing escaped her ledger of judgment. Children playing too loudly, teenagers gathering on a driveway, visiting relatives parking overnight, Patricia recorded it all. And then there was Calvin. She seemed to circle him more than anyone else. Maybe it was because his ranch stood larger than most properties, its lakefront presence a reminder of independence that Patricia could not manage. Maybe it was because Calvin, steady and quiet, did not yield to her energy. Whatever the reason, Patricia treated him as though he were her greatest case study. At HOA meetings, her eyes always found him. Even when she addressed the room, Calvin could feel her gaze pressing against his skin, a silent message, "You are not exempt." 6 months before the deputies came to his house, Patricia had spoken for 20 straight minutes about unregulated lake access, her tone sharp, her binders snapping open with every point. Everyone knew she was aiming at Calvin's dock, though she never said his name. Calvin had kept his head down, answering nothing. Patricia's smile that evening had been thin, victorious, as though silence itself was proof she had scored a point. The truth was that Calvin had no interest in HOA politics. He paid his dues, kept his property neat, and minded his business. But Patricia seemed to take his quiet as defiance. She had watched him mow his lawn, repair his dock, host cookouts, all with the silent suspicion that somewhere in those acts was a violation waiting to be uncovered. So when she saw him that afternoon, camera on his shoulder, realtor by his side, she didn't see a man preparing to sell his home. She saw unusual activity. She saw something that could be reported, controlled, stamped with authority. And she made the call. To her, it wasn't just about safety. It was about winning. About proving that even Calvin Rauden, with his 15 years of roots in the soil, could be made to show papers, to justify himself. What Patricia never realized was that in that single act, she crossed an invisible line. Because Calvin wasn't like the others, quick to fold or avoid her wrath. He was steady. He was patient. And patience, in Calvin's hands, was sharper than any rule Patricia carried in her binder. The community hall smelled faintly of old carpet and weak coffee, the kind of scent that clung to every small-town meeting room in Texas. Rows of folding chairs faced a plain table at the front, where the HOA board sat in varying degrees of boredom. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening when most people would rather be home with dinner than listening to disputes about landscaping and dues. But the hall was full. Calvin slipped into a seat near the back, his hat pulled low. He hadn't wanted to come, but after the deputies had shown up at his ranch, he knew Patricia wouldn't stop at a phone call. He wanted to hear what she'd say in public. The room buzzed with murmurs until the gavel cracked against the table. Patricia Norwell, binder in hand, rose with the self-importance of a judge presiding over a trial. She didn't glance at Calvin, but he felt her presence directed at him like the beam of a flashlight. Our first item tonight, she began, flipping open her binder, concerns suspicious activities observed on private properties. I have personally noticed an increase in unauthorized photography, unusual gatherings, and potential trespassing. It is a safety concern for all of us. Her voice carried across the room, sharp and clear. Neighbors shifted in their chairs, eyes darting toward Calvin though his name hadn't been mentioned. Calvin sat perfectly still, jaw tight. We cannot afford to ignore unusual behavior, Patricia continued. Better to report and be safe than to regret later. Samantha, who had joined Calvin for moral support, leaned closer and whispered, "She's talking about you." Calvin didn't respond. He already knew. From the second row, Victor Hanley raised his hand. "Patricia, with all due respect, Calvin's lived here longer than most of us. He was taking pictures for a home listing. That's not suspicious. That's business." Patricia's lips curved into a tight smile. "Perhaps, but when neighbors see something unusual, they have the right, no, the responsibility, to report it. Community safety requires vigilance." The word vigilance hung heavy in the air. Some nodded reluctantly. Others frowned. Judy Blanchard crossed her arms, muttering under her breath, but loud enough for those nearby, "It's not vigilance, it's harassment." Patricia ignored her. She turned a page, rattled off other minor violations, trash bins, holiday decor, parking regulations. Each word carried the same clipped authority, the binder slamming shut with a finality that made the gavel unnecessary. For the remainder of the meeting, Calvin kept silent. His hands were folded, but inside his fists pressed tight against each other. He felt the sting of every sideways glance, every half-hidden smirk that said, "See, even he isn't safe." Patricia hadn't named him, but she had branded him nonetheless. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraping across the floor, Judy caught Calvin's arm near the door. "Don't let her get under your skin," she whispered. "That's what she wants. But between you and me, someone needs to put her in her place." Calvin nodded once, his face unreadable. Outside, twilight had settled over the lake. He walked to his truck slowly, the weight of Patricia's words pressing on his back like a stone. She thought she had one. She thought the humiliation of being called out, of being turned into an unspoken example, would silence him. But Calvin's silence was never surrender. As he drove home, headlights cutting across the winding road, he remembered his mother's words again, "If you don't set your boundary firm, people will keep taking." Patricia had crossed the line. She just didn't know yet that Calvin had drawn one of his own. And when the time came, he would make sure she saw it carved into the dust so deep she could never ignore it. The evening had been ordinary, the kind of late Thursday when Calvin returned from work, loosened his tie, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, scrolling through listings more out of habit than purpose. He had already decided to sell his ranch, but sometimes he browsed properties around Lake Travis anyway, a quiet way of saying goodbye to the market that had once given him his dream. And then he saw it. At first his eyes skimmed past, not registering. But then the address struck him like a tap on the shoulder. He leaned closer, the glow of the screen reflecting in his steady eyes. A narrow strip of land, tucked between two larger properties. No house. Just grass, trees, and a dock that reached into the lake like a finger pointing at the horizon. Patricia Norwell. The listing spelled it out, the parcel belonged to her. Calvin recognized it immediately. He had seen her there dozens of evenings, glass of wine in hand, perched at the end of the dock as if she were queen of the water. She had bragged about that access at HOA meetings, wielding it as proof that she was a more responsible homeowner than those without lake rights. And now, there it was. For sale. Calvin sat back, a slow smile curving at the corner of his mouth. He didn't laugh. He didn't gloat. He simply let the weight of the moment settle. Patricia had fired the first shot when she called the deputies. This was his chance to answer, not with anger but with precision. He picked up his phone and dialed Samantha. "I need you to pull details on a listing," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "Belongs to a Patricia Norwell." There was a pause. "Patricia, as in that Patricia?" Samantha asked. "The one and only." Her tone brightened with curiosity. "You're thinking about buying it?" Calvin's gaze never left the screen. "I'm more than thinking. But I don't want my name anywhere near it. We'll use Rauden Holdings, the LLC I set up years ago. Keep it quiet until it closes." Samantha chuckled. "That's one way to send a message. You know she's going to lose her mind when she finds out." "That's the point," Calvin replied, voice steady. The days that followed were thick with waiting. The offer went out, reasonable, not extravagant, enough to tempt someone looking for quick cash. Patricia hadn't responded yet. Calvin imagined her at her kitchen table, binder open, weighing every page of the contract. Did she suspect? Did she even consider that the man across the cul-de-sac might be behind it? He didn't care. Patience was his nature. Finally, the call came. Samantha's voice over the line was bright. "Congratulations, Calvin." She accepted. "Papers are signed. Closing next week." Calvin let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He walked out onto his porch, glass of bourbon in hand, watching Patricia stroll with her dog along the street. She waved politely to another neighbor, unaware. She had no idea that within days, her dock would no longer be hers. It wasn't pettiness. It wasn't even revenge in the simple sense. It was balance. Patricia had tried to strip him of dignity with one call. Now she would know what it felt like to lose something that defined her. And the best part was that she had delivered the opportunity herself. The morning after closing day, the air felt different, lighter, sharper, as though the lake itself knew something had shifted. Calvin trimmed the hedges along his driveway, the electric hum of the trimmer steady in his hands. For once, his thoughts weren't restless. The papers were signed, the deed transferred. The dock that had once been Patricia's was now his. He had just set the trimmer down when he heard the slam of a car door. The sound was sharp, purposeful. He looked up to see Patricia marching toward him, binder clutched like a weapon against her side. Her face was flushed, eyes hard as glass. "You," she spat before she'd even reached him. She pointed a finger, sharp as a dagger. "Was it you? Did you buy my lot?" Calvin bent slowly, resting the trimmer against the fence before straightening. He met her gaze with the calmness of someone who had already won. "Patricia," he said evenly, "good afternoon to you too. Don't play games with me." Her voice trembled with fury. "The offer came from some company, but I know it was you. No one else around here would have reason." Calvin tilted his head. "Does it matter who the buyer is? What matters is that you put it up for sale. Someone bought it. That's how the market works." Her chest heaved. "You think this is funny? You think you can just strip me of my lake access, my dock, as if it's some game?" "I didn't strip you of anything," Calvin replied, voice calm, almost soft. "You chose to sell. I simply saw an opportunity." "You're petty," she hissed. "This is revenge." Calvin folded his arms. "Revenge? No. I didn't call deputies on you. I didn't make you prove you belonged on your own property. I didn't humiliate you in front of your neighbors. You did that to me. All I did was play by the rules you love so much." Patricia's mouth opened, then closed. For once, words seemed to falter. She clutched her binder tighter, as though it could shield her from the weight of his calmness. "I'll take this to the board," she snapped finally. "I'll bring it up at the next meeting. You can't block me from my own dock." Calvin's voice was steady, his tone almost conversational. "It's not your dock anymore, Patricia. It's mine. And the board can't rewrite a deed." Her eyes widened, fury crackling in them like lightning. For a moment she looked as though she might strike him. But instead she spun on her heels hammering the pavement as she stormed back toward her car. Calvin watched her go, then picked up the trimmer again, the hum filling the silence she left behind. His pulse was steady. He hadn't raised his voice once. For Patricia, the confrontation had been war. For Calvin, it was confirmation. He no longer needed to imagine what balance looked like. He was standing on it. The community center buzzed long before the meeting began. Folding chairs scraped against linoleum, neighbors fanned themselves with folded agendas, and the air carried the sharp tang of anticipation. Everyone knew this meeting would be different. Word had already spread, Patricia had lost her lot. Calvin arrived quietly, slipping into a seat near the back as usual. He wore his calm-like armor, though beneath it his chest burned with the memory of that afternoon when deputies asked for his ID. Patricia had humiliated him in silence. Tonight, she would try again, but this time, there would be witnesses. At 6 o'clock sharp, Patricia strode to the front. Her binder looked heavier than ever, papers bristling from its edges like flags on a battlefield. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and called the meeting to order. "Our first agenda item," she began, her voice slicing through the chatter, "concerns property disputes and recent developments that threaten the integrity of our community standards." The room hushed. Neighbors leaned forward. They had come for this. "As many of you know," Patricia continued, "I recently sold a parcel of land that provided me with lake access. What I did not anticipate," she paused dramatically, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd until it landed squarely on Calvin, "was that a fellow resident would manipulate the transaction in order to strip me of my rights. It was personal. Vindictive. A hostile act that undermines the spirit of this community." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Some eyes flicked toward Calvin. Others darted away. From the third row, Victor spoke up. "Hold on, Patricia. He bought land you listed. Nobody forced you to sell it. That's not the point." Patricia snapped, binder slamming shut with a crack. "The offer came from a shell company. He hid his name until it was too late. That is deception, plain and simple." Judy crossed her arms. "Deception? Please. That's business. You put it on the market. He followed the rules." Laughter bubbled in the room, small but real. Patricia's face tightened. This isn't about rules, she said, her voice rising. It's about values. When a neighbor acts with malice, it damages all of us. At last, Calvin stood. His chair scraped softly against the floor. His voice, when it came, was low but clear, steady as stone. You called deputies on me for taking photos of my own ranch. You made me prove I belonged on land I've poured 15 years into. You humiliated me, not because I broke a rule, but because you wanted control. And I let it go. I stayed silent. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. But then you sold your lot. And I bought it. By the rules. If that feels like a loss, Patricia, it's because for once, you didn't get to control the outcome. For a moment, the room was silent. Then applause broke out, hesitant at first, then louder, rolling across the hall like a wave. Patricia's face reddened. She gripped her binder as though it were the last defense she had. So we allow sabotage now? Neighbors targeting neighbors? That's the precedent we're setting? From the back, Alan McPherson raised his voice. No, Patricia. The precedent is that you don't weaponize the sheriff's office against people you don't like. Calvin had every right to do what he did. Frankly, it's about time someone stood up to you. The applause swelled again. Patricia's gavel clattered uselessly against the table as she tried to shout the meeting back to order, but the tide had turned. For once, she wasn't the authority. She was the spectacle. Calvin sat down, face calm, though inside his chest burned with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't needed to. The truth had carried its own weight. Patricia rushed through the remainder of the agenda, trembling, her voice thinner than usual. When the meeting finally adjourned, she stormed out, binder clutched so tightly the plastic edges bent under her grip. Victor clapped Calvin on the shoulder as they walked out. That was something, man. You didn't just win, you showed everyone she's not untouchable. Calvin gave a small nod. She wanted control. Tonight, she lost it. But as he drove home under the lake's twilight sky, one thought lingered like a shadow: Patricia wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The neighborhood felt different after the meeting. The air carried a tension that lingered between porches and across hedges, in the way neighbors greeted one another, or chose not to. Conversations at the local coffee shop broke into whispers whenever Patricia's name came up, or Calvin's. Lines had been drawn. Some sided with Patricia, murmuring that Calvin's purchase was too harsh, that he had gone too far in proving his point. Others, weary of years of Patricia's rule, quietly admitted they admired him. They called it balance, long overdue. For the first time, Patricia wasn't untouchable. But Patricia was not one to retreat. She continued hosting small gatherings at her house, her so-called community preservation circle. There, she painted herself as the victim, betrayed, stripped of her dock by a neighbor's cruelty. She promised she would find a way to make Calvin regret what he had done. Her binder remained ever present, swollen with new tabs and fresh paper. Calvin expected no less. He had never believed Patricia would surrender. But he also knew she had lost something greater than a dock. She had lost the fear she thrived on. And that could not be reclaimed. As the weeks passed, Calvin moved forward with his plan to sell the ranch. Dallas awaited, with new work, new space, and a life that no longer orbited Patricia's shadow. Yet leaving wasn't defeat. It was release. One evening, Victor and Judy joined him on the porch. They shared a simple meal, laughter drifting over the lake. At one point, Judy leaned in and said softly, "You know, Calvin, people can argue about what you did, but one thing's certain. You showed her, and all of us, that respect isn't optional. It's non-negotiable." Victor raised his beer. "To standing your ground." Calvin lifted his glass. "To knowing when enough is enough." They clinked together, the sound carrying lightly into the evening. Later, when the house was quiet, Calvin stepped down to the dock that had once been Patricia's. The boards were solid beneath his boots, the water stretching out into darkness. He thought of his mother's words, spoken decades ago in a rented kitchen. "One day, son, you'll plant your feet on soil that's yours. And when you do, you'll know the difference." He had planted them. He had defended them. And when someone tried to strip that dignity away, he had drawn his boundary firm. Patricia would never forget the lesson. Neither would the neighborhood. Calvin turned back toward the house, steady, certain. He wasn't leaving in defeat. He was leaving on his own terms. Because respect, once claimed, could not be taken.